Will you pray with me? God, please add a blessing to these words that I speak, that they might be what we need to hear to be the people you need this day. Amen. He was so angry. It felt like all the time, angry in a way he couldn't make go away, angry in a way that was so much a part of him that he no longer even saw it or noticed it as being abnormal. His body had settled into a tension that never left him. He was angry at his neighbors, angry they didn't just respect the law, angry in particular at the groups that were rising up around that man who had been killed, angry at leaders for doing nothing about it. Was it unfortunate that he died? Yes, of course. No one was saying that it wasn't tragic, but he also wasn't following the rules. So it happens. If people just followed the rules, they wouldn't get hurt. If people just followed the rules, he wouldn't have to be so angry. So he read all the time these arguments that agreed with him, and he fell deeper and deeper into a kind of zealousness, the kind that mistakes witty arguments and indignation for justice and truth, the kind that divides the world into sides. Soon, he was leaving his hometown just to rally others, to try and root out the ones he thought of as outsiders. Consequences be damned. I don't know if his family and friends started worrying about him when he started traveling, or if they supported him, recognizing that same anger in themselves, that same tension in themselves, understood it, in fact, to be a product of the times, all the uncertainty around them. Probably they agreed with him. He was persuasive, really persuasive, in fact, really good at pitting us versus them. There was that one time that the rally devolved into a persecution, but again, he refused to feel bad about it. The way he saw it, he was doing God's work. Now, personally, what I wonder is if he was tired, because I know I am. I wonder if Saul of Tarsus, who spent his life packing up his belongings and walking the dusty miles to other synagogues and cities to convince others to root out Christians from the Jewish fold, I wonder if he was in some way relieved when he was struck blind by the light, when he understood Jesus to have visited him. In one version, Jesus telling him to stop kicking at the goads, which, by the way, I love. A goad is the prod that farmers use on their oxen with a pointy end to goad them in the right direction. And if an ox kicked at the goad, it simply made the stick make more contact with the rear end. So it was a futile and exhausting action. Evidently, God had been trying to talk to Saul for a while. Stop kicking the goad. So I wonder if he was relieved to not have to carry that anger with him anymore, to just be able to set it down and walk away. Wouldn't that be nice? To be able to set it down and walk away? To feel the tension finally relax after what seems like years? To acknowledge the anger you have been feeling is edging over into hate and it hurts? To take a deep breath and not have it feel like it threatens to well up all the sorrow that you have been holding over George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, over this virus, which had its highest U.S. new case count ever on Friday. What would it feel like to stop kicking against the goads? What would it look like? This week, we begin to think about stewardship more intentionally, to really focus on it over the next few weeks to see what it means for each of us. Now, stewardship in the church has come to be a shorthand term for fundraising for a local congregation, and that, of course, is essential. Money is the language we use to express our values, the tool we have to build those values in the world. But good stewardship Good stewardship develops out of a much wider foundation or understanding. Good stewardship, even for institutions outside of the church, is based upon three things: an understanding of the importance of relationship, long-term visions and goals, and a sense of spiritual purpose, personally and collectively, even for institutions outside of the church. These are also, by the way, the three keys to a truly balanced, centered spiritual life: a sense of unique purpose, which is to say a relationship between you and the Creator, a sense that your faith is formed in community with the world and for the common good, and based upon the long-term visions and goals of God's time and God's kingdom, as revealed to us in careful relationship to Scripture and tradition. Over the next few weeks, we are going to talk about the other aspects of relationship and vision. But today I want to look at that sense of spiritual purpose. I know that we are tired. I hear that in the edge in all of our voices, whether it is spoken or typed. I'm receiving the calls, parents or siblings or spouses who are sick, friends who are hospitalized, the mental health crisis that is occurring right now, the return to addictions long thought vanquished. I am hearing the no's loud and clear. I can't, it's too much. My life is too full. I am too full. And just at the moment in our lives where we need each other the most, when we need our faith the most, when we need a clear sense of our purpose the most, we stop being able to show up. For some of us, this means mistaking physical distancing for social distancing, social isolation. We take our exhaustion and we retreat inward and lash outward. It's exhaustion, folks. We are tired. And how could we not be? How could we not be tired? It turns out that is actually the fundamental question of stewardship. How could we not be so tired? How could we not be so overwhelmed and yet left so empty? How do we cultivate a spiritual purpose that not only sustains us during these hard times, but also sustains the world in these hard times? That is the question of stewardship. Now, 20 years after his meeting with Jesus, Saul, going by his Greek name Paul, he has an answer for these questions. And it sounds an awful lot like stop kicking at the goads. Now there are varieties of gifts, but the same Spirit, he writes. There are a variety of services, but the same Lord. There are a variety of activities, but it is the same God who activates all of them in everyone. To each is given the manifestation of the Spirit for the common good. Stop kicking at goads and start looking at whether and how you are using your gifts. If, of course, you even know what they are. As Richard Leider and David Shapiro write in their work, Whistle While You Work, all of us have gifts. Oddly, though, many of us have a difficult time identifying them. Ironically, the things we are best at are those which are most difficult to see. Most people can quite readily identify their weaknesses. Far fewer of us can say with assurance what our strengths are. Far fewer of us can say with assurance what our strengths are. The unique things that God has given us for the building of a better life, not for ourselves, but for others. Friends, when was the last time you were so absorbed in something that you completely lost all track of time? What was it about that time that was so absorbing? Was it the numbers on a spreadsheet and how you were able to make them add up logically? Was it the photos on a slideshow where you were able to tell a story? Was it the conversation you were having with a client? What was that conversation about? Was it finding a solution to something that no one else could fix? Was it learning something new? Or perhaps it was the vulnerability of sharing. really take a moment right now to think about it. Put yourself in that moment. Where were you? What does that moment tell you of when you come alive? This week, you have homework. And before you groan, remember, as Nancy read earlier in the service, as with the attainment of intellectual maturity, growth towards spiritual maturity will of necessity involve moral effort, discipline, renunciation, and perseverance in pursuit of the goal. There are no shortcuts. But I think you might like this homework, because this week I want you to spend some time thinking about your gifts, really owning them. These are not aptitudes or talents. As Lieber writes, take Steve Jobs of Apple, for example. His special skill would seem to be inspiring people to organize themselves around a vision for the future. Many individual skills and talents go into this. He's obviously an excellent speaker, motivator, product designer, and so on, but his gift, it's greater than the sum of these parts. The important thing to remember about our gifts is that they are just that, gifts. They have been bestowed upon us, he continues. They have been bestowed upon us. So what I am asking you to do is not bragging, it is evaluating. Make a list, really. There are a few ways you can do this. The first is simply to ask. Lieber reminds us that people who know us well, they can usually say quite easily what we do well. They recognize our gifts in action in ways that we don't. Think about our own friends and family. We often marvel at their abilities, feel jealous even, while they take them totally for granted. You probably have friends who can fix anything, or who are fantastic chefs, or who always seem to know the right thing to say to make someone feel better. But if you tell them about how impressed you are, they'll just shrug their shoulders and say it's no big deal. Ask and offer. Right now even, let's start right now. Those of you who have been commenting on the chats here on YouTube, the chats disappear after the service, so you don't have to worry about it being preserved in perpetuity. But what gifts do you see in others who are here today? Type it in right now. At the risk of both inclusion and exclusion, I'll start. Mike Nauer, I know you're going to be here, and you are extremely gifted at seeing both the big picture of an issue and the steps necessary to get there. Susan Saunders, you are wonderful at fostering connections. Kapeni Tabu, boy, do you ever have the gift of prayer. Really, guys, go ahead, type them in. What gifts do you see in the people gathered here this morning? Start a conversation. And while you do that, I'm going to recap. This is homework 1. Have a conversation with someone about their gifts and your gifts. Work backwards from that moment when the last time that time fell away. What were you working towards in that moment? How does that tell you about what you are passionate about how you spend your time? The other way you can do this is you can also take a free StrengthsFinder test. Now, I'm going to post the link of 2 of the best free ones in the comments. They only take a few minutes, and they actually come quite well researched. So, that's your homework. Have a conversation about gifts. Think about the last time that time lost its meaning. Take a test. Figure out what your gifts are. Really spend time with them. Now, of course, Paul was using his gifts, oration, persuasion, argumentation, back when he went by Saul. But he still had the anger, of course, the hate that he was instilling, going synagogue to synagogue, rounding up new Christians. That kind of anger and vitriol sounds familiar, doesn't it? Pitting brother against brother. Feeling that my way is not only the right way, but God's way. The knots in your shoulders and neck. It is, of course, not enough to know our gifts. We must also know how to use them. How not to fight against the goad, but to lean into it. And that is what we are going to be talking about over these next few weeks. Because think about Paul. He spent years angry, traveling to persecute, being well respected and well liked for his venom, like many today. But don't you know that he was exhausted? You have to be to have that kind of anger in you, that kind of self-righteousness. And then when he stopped, can't you just see it, maybe feel it, even the deep breath, the tension falling away? When he realized that his gifts were fighting against God's work of love instead of for it. Now, I know this was the case for Paul because we know he went from being on top of the world to being beaten and jailed, and still he was able to rejoice in it. And that only comes from a place of profound faith, a place of profound spiritual maturity, a place that leaves no room for the kind of hate that he had. Instead of sowing division, he finds himself here in our passage today writing to the church at Corinth, which was itself conflicted. He was working to repair breaches instead of creating them in a time that was no less divided than ours. We would do well to heed his advice, to live into that kind of faith, to start by seeing each other's gifts and seeing our own, and then working together to discern how they might best be used to repair the world in love, because that is the work of stewardship. To cultivate a life worth living, to let our work energize us rather than drain us, not despite the present circumstances, but because of them, and never alone. Thanks be to God.